It was a humid August morning in 1947 when 7-year-old Eleanor Ellie Johnson's world unraveled in a split second. She had been humming her favorite spiritual, a lullaby her mother called the Song of Hope, while pressing daisies between the pages of an old flour sack. With Mama's gentle hands, that simple sack had become Ellie's favorite dress, the one she wore to church each Sunday. But that morning, as she chased fireflies through the tall grass outside their little wooden house near Birmingham, Alabama, a neighbor came running breathlessly down the dirt path, tears shining on her cheeks. "Child, there's been an accident at the Montgomery place." Mrs. Peterson had sobbed, kneeling in the dust beside Ellie. "Your mama's been hurt." Ellie felt time slow, as though the cicadas themselves paused in mid-song. The words tumbled over each other, fallen down the grand staircase banister, polished, hushed whispers. But the truth, as Ellie would later piece together, was far more chilling than any whispered rumor. Mrs. Montgomery, furious over a cracked teacup, had shoved her housemaid Ellie's mother down those gleaming steps. In that moment, Ellie's song of hope became a plea for her mother's life and for her own. That kind of loss, so sudden, so violent, can shatter a child's sense of safety forever. Yet it was in those first moments of grief that Ellie came to understand the extraordinary power of community and of a single mentor's unwavering kindness. In the weeks following the funeral, the Johnson house became a revolving door of compassion. Neighbors carried covered dishes to the doorstep, sweet potato pie from Miss Ellie next door, extra vegetables from the Washington's garden, warm bread from Josephine's kitchen table. They didn't just bring food, they brought gentle reminders that life, even in its darkest chapters, could still hold tender moments of care. But of all the neighbors, one woman stood out, the real Miss Ellie. A matriarch in the community, with silver hair piled into a neat bun, and eyes that seemed always to be cradling a secret kindness. She slipped small books into Ellie's trembling hands, lit by candlelight, when the Johnson home's windows were dark with grief. "Your mama's quick mind lives in you," Miss Ellie whispered, smoothing stray curls from Ellie's forehead. And when Ellie stared at her own reflection with tear-blurry eyes, tracing every new wrinkle of sorrow on her young face, Miss Ellie pressed a hand to her shoulder. "Don't let anyone dim that light," she said. In the Jim Crow South of the late 1940s, neighbors like Miss Ellie were not just friends, they were lifelines. The Black Church Network in Montgomery and Birmingham functioned in many ways as a secret safety net. When white foster care systems refused to step in, when local authorities turned a blind eye to domestic violence within black families, it was churches and community elders who offered informal foster arrangements, who made sure a grieving child had a bed to sleep in and lessons to keep her mind sharp. Studies today show that mentorship programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and AmeriCorps Volunteers continue this legacy. One caring adult can dramatically improve a child's school attendance, self-esteem, and likelihood to pursue higher education. Ellie would come to learn decades later that investing in one child, giving her time, attention, and belief, can ripple outward to change entire communities. Yet communities also risk a bystander effect, a modern-day pitfall where too many people assume someone else will step in, and so no one does. Miss Ellie resisted that impulse. She noticed Ellie's dusty clothes, her thin frame weighed down by early mornings at the stove and late nights at the washboard. She volunteered at the schoolhouse, quietly convincing Ellie's teacher, Mrs. Johnson, to send home extra homework packets. On rare Sundays, when Ellie's father disappeared into whiskey-soaked stupors, Miss Ellie would collect her for library lessons, stoking the embers of curiosity in the young girl's heart. Contrast that with today's world of smartphones and crowded social media feeds. A viral video of a child in distress may draw hundreds of comments, but far fewer offers of concrete help. Many of us worry that stepping in is intrusive, or that we lack the authority to intervene. Yet Miss Ellie's example reminds us kindness doesn't require a title. It requires courage to notice a need and conviction to act. The seed Miss Ellie planted in Ellie's heart was twofold: a sense of belonging and the confidence to imagine a life beyond the confines of her father's decaying house. Ellie carried that seed like a secret talisman through the long nights of scrubbing laundry, through the whispered threats and bruising beatings her father doled out whenever his grief turned to rage. Each time Ellie felt herself wobble under despair, she would close her eyes and hear Miss Ellie's voice. "Your mama would be so proud of how strong you've become." In those moments, Ellie felt a warmth wrapping around her like a reassuring hug across the miles between her childhood grief and the woman she was destined to become. And so what begins as heartbreak became the foundation of resilience. Without Miss Ellie and the tapestry of support around her, Ellie might have retreated entirely into fear. Instead, she learned that no one endures trauma alone, and that survival often hinges on those who refuse to look away. That truth holds just as power today. In neighborhoods across America, children still face adversity, poverty, domestic strife, systemic injustice. Programs that link them with caring mentors have shown remarkable results: improved academic performance, reduced risky behaviors, and increased community engagement. The lesson is clear. A single person's investment of time and empathy can become the lifeline a child needs to navigate trauma and emerge stronger. As we'll see in the next section, Ellie's journey from a frightened little girl to a survivor didn't end with community support alone. It evolved into personal strategies for coping with abuse, and later the determination to stand up against injustice, not just for herself, but for her entire community. But none of that would have been possible without the spark lit by one remarkable mentor. It started as whispers and insults long before the first bruise ever appeared. After her mother's death, Ellie threw herself into keeping the house spotless, the stove hot and her father's glass filled. In the beginning, he was simply distant, cold, flat words dripping from the whiskey haze. "Can't even fry an egg, child," he'd mutter as he pushed away her meager meals. Those words stung like nettles, but they were nothing compared to what came next. 1. The escalation of violence. In family violence research, we often see a recognizable pattern: criticism and controlling behavior give way over time to verbal threats and eventually to physical abuse. According to the National Institute of Justice, more than 65% of domestic violence victims report that psychological abuse preceded physical assaults by weeks or even months. Ellie's story followed that same sad arc. Year 1. Her father's sarcasm grew sharper. He criticized her cooking, her school absences, her very existence. Each barb chipped away at Ellie's self-worth, normalizing the idea that she was not enough. Year 2. The first shove came when Ellie burned the cornbread. She stumbled backward, the hot stove searing her dress and her skin before he blinked in surprise at his own strength. Shock rooted her in place, the pain searing both body and soul. Year 3 words weren't enough. His whiskey-fueled rages ended with slaps to her face or fists against her skinny shoulders. Ellie learned to curl inward, make herself invisible, scrubbing away the bruise before the sun rose. In the 1950s, talking about family violence was taboo. The prevailing attitude in many communities, especially under Jim Crow, was that family business stays family business. A black child's screams or cries were ignored by authorities who considered it a private matter, or even justified physical discipline under the guise of teaching respect. Contrast that with today's post-#MeToo world. There is far more awareness, mandatory reporting laws in schools and hospitals, and a vast network of hotlines ready to answer a call for help. But stigma still lingers, And many victims, especially children, continue to hide their pain, believing they deserve the punishment or fearing that speaking up will only make things worse. 2. Coping mechanisms and common pitfalls. When Ellie started covering her arms with long sleeves in sweltering Alabama heat, it wasn't fashion, it was survival. She hid her wounds, determined not to give her father any more ammunition. But hiding bruises, as many survivors have learned, often becomes a trap. It prevents outsiders from knowing there's a problem, and it convinces the victim that the abuse is their secret, their shame. Pitfall 1. Isolation through secrecy. By her 12th birthday, Ellie had mastered the art of invisibility. She scrubbed laundry by lantern light so no neighbors would see her wounds. She never complained to teachers, fearing they'd send her back to a harder punishment. Isolation is a powerful tool in an abuser's arsenal. It keeps victims from seeking help and convinces them that no one would believe them. Pitfall 2. Misplaced self-blame. Like many young survivors, Ellie internalized her father's words. "You're no use. You caused your mother's death." Shame rooted itself so deeply that even the comfort of Mrs. Henderson, her later mentor, required effort to accept. In modern interventions, programs such as those run by the Annie E. Casey Foundation teach survivors self-advocacy, identifying abusive patterns, understanding that they are not to blame, and learning to articulate their needs in safe spaces. Healthy coping, turning pain into purpose. Ellie discovered a different path through the kindness of Miss Ellie, and later through Mrs. Henderson's sewing lessons. Each stitch in a new dress became an act of reclaiming her body from violence. Today we call that creative therapy, using art, music, or craft to transform trauma. Modern research shows that creative expression can lower anxiety, improve mood, and rebuild a sense of agency in survivors. Ellie's growing skill at the sewing machine was more than a trade. It was a lifeline, a concrete way to assert that her body and her hands were her own. 3. Early intervention matters. Had Ellie had access to the network of support that exists today, her trajectory might have shifted faster. Imagine mandatory school reporting. A teacher notices bruises and is legally bound to alert Child Protective Services. 24/7 Domestic Violence Hotline. A sympathetic voice on the other end offers immediate safety planning and connects the child's advocates to local shelters. Peer support groups. Safe teen spaces, whether in community centers or online, where survivors share stories and strategies, breaking the isolation that emboldens abusers. Research consistently shows that early intervention can dramatically reduce the long-term psychological impact of child abuse, decreasing rates of depression, PTSD, and high-risk behaviors in adulthood. Ellie paid a steep price for each year of silence. Yet she also embodied the truth that resilience can grow wherever someone extends a hand. A modern parallel. The Safe Horizon model today. Community coalitions like Safe Horizon in New York City combine legal aid counseling and emergency housing to protect domestic violence victims. Their children's program provides art therapy, academic tutoring, and legal advocacy under one roof. Survivors who engage with comprehensive services report 40% higher rates of long-term safety and well-being compared to those who only access one type of service. Though Ellie didn't have these resources, her later success speaks to the same principle. Addressing both the practical and emotional needs of survivors is key to healing. 4. Lessons for today's audience. Ellie's ordeal under her father's hand offers a roadmap of both warning signs and remedies. Recognize the warning signs. Verbal put-downs, controlling behavior, sudden mood swings, all red flags before the first punch. Break the isolation. If you see a child withdrawing, changing clothes abruptly, or speaking fearfully of home, step in. A simple, "I'm here if you need to talk" can break the silence. Leverage community resources. Schools, churches, and local nonprofits often have confidential reporting channels. Even a phone call to a domestic violence hotline can set protective wheels in motion. Support creative outlets. Encourage young survivors to find a craft art form or sport that gives them control over their body and mind. Whether it's sewing music or skateboarding creative expression rebuilds agency. Shift the narrative. Survivors are not defined by their scars. Sharing stories like Ellie's helps dismantle shame and rally collective support. Ellie eventually emerged from that dark period not just intact, but with a fierce determination to protect others. She turned her pain into purpose, sewing not just dresses, but the fabric of a movement for justice. And she learned, as today's advocates affirm, that no child should face abuse alone. That spring afternoon in Birmingham felt different. The sun hung low, casting golden light across dusty streets. But inside Ellie's small room at the Hendersons, the air crackled with something far more powerful than heat possibility. She sat cross-legged on the floor, leaning against the edge of an oak trunk that held Mrs. Henderson's sewing supplies, listening to the faint crackle of a battered radio. The announcer's voice trembled with urgency. Today, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education, declaring that separate but equal has no place in public schools. Ellie pressed her hand to her heart. She was 13, old enough to remember the terrifying hush in her father's house, when he ranted about uppity coloured folk, but young enough to feel astonishment that a group of 9 white-robed justices in Washington, D.C. could challenge the very foundation of segregation in Alabama. 1. Brown v. Board and Southern Massive Resistance. In May 1954, Brown v. Board overturned Plessy versus Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine, ruling that segregated schools were inherently unequal. But in Birmingham and beyond, the response was swift and fierce. Alabama's Governor John Patterson vowed to maintain a separate but equal system, and Birmingham's public schools remained as divided as ever. Businesses posted whites-only signs overnight, and local newspapers decried the decision as a federal overreach. Why it mattered to Ellie? In her mind, a school desk wasn't just a piece of furniture, it represented a chance for a life beyond daily chores and bruises. Suddenly, that desk felt within reach. Historical comparison. In 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, the resulting boycott was chronicled in mainstream newspapers and newsreels. A year later, footage of Montgomery's black citizens marching arm in arm reached living rooms across America. Contrast that with 2020's racial justice protests images and live streams on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok mobilized millions in hours, not weeks. Both eras show that shining a light, whether via film reel or smartphone, can galvanize public opinion. Ellie would later learn that the pace of change often hinges on how well activists harness the media of their day. In 1954, it was newspapers, radio, and occasionally television. Today, social platforms can explode a local incident into a global movement overnight. 2. Hearing Dr. King's voice. A few years later, Ellie sat in the Hendersons' parlor as Mrs. Henderson tuned the radio to a station broadcasting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches from Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. His voice, rich, resonant, and laced with both kindness and steel, filled the room. We must meet physical force with soul force. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Ellie felt the words in her bones. For the first time since her mother's death and her father's violence, she understood that personal pain could be channeled into something far greater than herself. King wasn't just talking about protests. He was teaching a philosophy of non-violence rooted in the teachings of Jesus, Gandhi, and the Black church tradition. Key principle: Nonviolent direct action aims to expose injustice by voluntarily accepting the consequences of breaking unjust laws, thus appealing to the conscience of the oppressor and the broader public. Local climate Birmingham, known for its steel mills and Gold Coast elites, was among the most segregated cities in America. Police Commissioner Bull Connor famously bragged, "We don't mind discrimination, but we don't want any mingling of the races." Connor's fire hoses and attack dogs would soon become the grisly symbols of Southern resistance. 3. Training in nonviolent tactics theory meets practice. Knowing that conviction alone wasn't enough, church leaders in Birmingham organized training sessions in nonviolent resistance. Ellie nervously signed up, joining a handful of teenagers and a few community elders in the basement of 16th Street Baptist Church. The classroom drill one Sunday afternoon, they reenacted a mock arrest. Young volunteers played police officers wielding rubber clubs to avoid injury, while others practiced how to protect their vital organs, curling into a tight fetal position, guarding their heads with forearms and going limp when seized. Psychological stress training. Before the drill, trainers played recordings of angry shouts and barking dogs. Participants learned to control their breathing, to inhale slowly through the nose and exhale through pursed lips, so that if real violence erupted, they could maintain composure and stick to non-violence. Ellie's first attempt was shaky. When Officer Carter tapped her arm, she flinched, instinctively swatting at his baton. A trainer gently guided her back. "Remember, Miss Johnson, non-violence means no retaliation, not a single push or shout. We do this to keep the moral high ground, mistake to avoid." Many believe that simply sitting at a lunch counter or marching across a bridge is enough. In reality, effective non-violent protest requires rigorous training in both personal discipline and group coordination. Without it, spontaneous actions can backfire, leading to chaos, injuries, and weakened public sympathy. 4. Planning meets execution. Equipped with both vision and tactics, the Birmingham campaign of 1963 was meticulously organized. Leaders divided volunteers into teams, responsible for sit-ins at segregated department stores, sales counter boycotts, and church marches. Each group had media liaisons to notify local and national press of planned actions. Legal support teams from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference (SCLC), ready to file habeas corpus petitions for arrested protesters. Medical volunteers stationed discreetly to care for injuries. Jail support networks to visit detainees, deliver food, and coordinate phone calls. When hundreds of children and teenagers joined the marches, an approach so provocative it worried even Dr. King. The plan was to create an image too vivid for the nation to ignore: young black faces, peaceful and dignified, confronted by snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. Outcome. On May 3, 1963, newsreels captured police dogs lunging and hoses blasting at full force. The images shocked white America and became the turning point that forced federal intervention. 5. Lessons for modern activists. Ellie's journey from radio listener to frontline marcher offers timeless takeaways. Combine moral clarity with tactical rigor. Passion without planning can lead to disarray. Modern movements should invest as much energy in strategy sessions as in social media hashtags. Leverage relatable narratives. Ellie's story and Dr. King's speeches framed the fight for integration not as abstract politics, but as a moral crusade for children's futures, playing to universal values of fairness and dignity. Today's advocates can emulate this by telling personal stories that humanize systemic issues. Prepare for backlash. Just as Bull Connor unleashed brutality, today's protesters risk online harassment, doxing, or violent confrontations. Training in de-escalation and digital security alongside physical tactics remains essential. Build multi-layered support. Effective campaigns. Link on-the-ground actions with legal interventions. medical aid, media outreach, and community care. Siloed efforts limit impact. Holistic coalitions amplify it. That golden light afternoon, Ellie closed the radio with trembling hands and took a deep breath. The world she had known of chores and bruises of second-hand grief felt both familiar and impossibly small. Ahead lay crowded jails, frightened nights, and marches that would test every ounce of her courage. But she carried with her the lessons of history and the tools of disciplined nonviolence. She stood smoothing the hem of her plain cotton dress, now a symbol of quiet defiance, and stepped out into the heat, ready to join the ranks of those who believed that dignity and strategy together could change not just a single city, but a nation. Ellie never imagined that the same hands that had once trembled with fear beneath her father's blows would one day grasp a microphone and address crowds of strangers. Yet by the spring of 1963, she found herself thrust into a new role, not just as a marcher risking fire hoses and police dogs, but as a storyteller, one whose words could shape how millions saw the struggle for civil rights. 1. From jail cell to front page feature. It began with a reporter from a national magazine who visited the Birmingham jail on a muggy May afternoon. Ellie, tired from days of overcrowded cells and meagre rations, expected a quick set of questions and a hurried exit. Instead, the journalist lingered, guiding her gently through her story about her mother's tragic death, her father's violence, and the moment she decided that surviving alone wasn't enough, that she must fight not just for herself, but for every child denied a future by Jim Crow. When that feature appeared, 2 pages devoted to the girl who wouldn't be invisible, Ellie saw her own face staring back from newsstands in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. At first, the sensation was surreal, even frightening. She worried about retaliation, about her name echoing in the same phone lines used to threaten bombs. But she also recognized something urgent, the power of a personal narrative to cut through apathy. Media lesson. Personal stories build bridges. Ellie's raw honesty humanized the abstract concept of segregation. Readers who had never met a black child in person suddenly knew her fears, her hopes, her laughter. The takeaway for modern changemakers is clear data and policy debates matter, but nothing resonates like a first-person account. Whether you're raising awareness of climate change, inviting people to vote, or rallying support for criminal justice reform, weaving in a compelling individual story can transform statistics into empathy. 2. Crafting your message with intention. As invitations poured in to speak at churches in Atlanta, to lead panels in Chicago, to address college campuses in the North, Ellie realized she needed more than passion. She needed structure. She studied the speeches of Dr. King and other seasoned orators. She noticed recurring patterns. A strong opening, a vivid image or unexpected fact to seize attention immediately, a personal anchor, a brief anecdote that grounds the speech in lived experience, a broader connection, tying the personal story to universal values, justice, dignity, freedom, a clear call to action. What each listener can do right after they leave the hall. Her trainer at the SCLC, Reverend Lewis, sat with her in Memphis one afternoon, clipboard in hand, and said, "Ellie, your story's powerful, but we need a hook that cements it in people's minds. Let's try this. 3 years ago, I was scrubbing floors by lantern light, hiding bruises under my sleeves. Today, I stand before you free of chains. Feel it." That contrast makes the heart beat faster. They worked line by line, pruning unnecessary details and sharpening key phrases. Ellie learned to rehearse facing a tape recorder, listening back not for what she said, but for how she sounded, where her voice cracked, where she rushed, where she lost energy. By the time she stepped onto the stage of the Civic Auditorium in Richmond, Virginia, she carried not only the weight of history, but the confidence of someone who had deliberately honed her craft. Speaking tip rehearse like an athlete. Top performers in any field, musicians, athletes, even surgeons, practice deliberately. They break down their performance into components and repeat them under pressure. For public speakers, that means rehearsing in the actual room, if possible, with a small audience and inviting feedback on pacing, volume, and body language. Ellie's success shows that authenticity alone isn't enough. You must also master the delivery. 3. Managing the narrative in a charged environment. Every time Ellie spoke, she faced two parallel audiences, those hungry for inspiration and those determined to undermine her message. Loyalty to the movement required discipline, no slip-ups, no inflammatory language that opponents could twist. She often said quietly to herself before stepping up, "They can't refute my facts, but they can distort my words." So she learned to repeat, don't improvise. Stick to tested talking points, especially when cameras or microphones were present. Bridge. Tough. Questions when a hostile interviewer asked, "Don't you think these protests will tear communities apart?" She masterfully replied, "Our communities are already torn apart by segregation and violence. We're here to mend them, not to rip them further. Stay on message." If the conversation veered into tangents, like the personal tragedy of her father, she gently steered it back. "My father's anger hurt me, but my fight today is about every child denied a chance because of the color of their skin." Pitfall to avoid playing defense. Activists often fall into the trap of reacting to every criticism, which gives opponents free airtime. Instead, Ellie learned to acknowledge contrasting views briefly and then pivot to her core points, ensuring the narrative stayed focused on her vision for equality. 4. Harnessing emerging media channels. By 1963, television news was on the rise, but print and radio still dominated. Ellie was strategic radio interviews, short segments where her voice could evoke emotions even without visuals. Listeners could imagine her trembling as she spoke of jail cells or hear hope in her laughter when recounting her wedding at 16th Street Baptist Church. Television appearances. Limited to 30-second news bites. She worked with station managers to secure longer-form interviews on public affairs shows, ensuring she had time to articulate her full message, op-eds and letters to editors. She penned essays for the Birmingham World and national magazines, laying out not just her experience, but policy proposals like mandatory school integration timelines and federal civil rights commissions with enforcement powers. In contrast, today's activists juggle a dizzying array of channels: Instagram Reels, Twitter threads, TikTok duets, live podcasts, newsletters, and more. Ellie's principle endures, though: know each medium's strengths and limits and craft your message accordingly. A heartfelt 60-second video may go viral but should link to a deeper resource or call to action for sustained engagement. 5. Amplifying impact through coalitions. Ellie's rise as a spokesperson wasn't just her personal achievement, it was deeply collaborative. She partnered with legal teams who provided data on segregation metrics which she could cite in speeches. Church networks that opened doors, arranged transportation, and mobilized volunteers. Student groups that coordinated live demonstrations synchronized with her talks, so audiences saw real-time action, not just rhetoric. Women's auxiliaries that produced leaflets summarizing her speeches in simple bullet points, ensuring even those without access to TVs or radios could spread her words. That web of support magnified Ellie's voice 100-fold. It's a model for today's changemakers. You cannot and should not act alone. Building a coalition of complementary partners lets each group play to its strengths while amplifying the overall message. 6. Clear calls to action. Turning inspiration into behavior. Every speech Ellie gave ended with a specific, doable challenge. Write your congressman this week and demand enforcement of desegregation orders. Volunteer at a local NOACP voter registration drive this Saturday at 10 a.m. If you're a white business owner, integrate your lunch counter by next Monday, or we'll be outside asking why you refuse. That specificity turned passive listeners into active participants. Abstract appeals to support civil rights can feel overwhelming or unfocused. Concrete directives channel energy into measurable steps. Modern organizers call these smart calls to action. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. 7. The ripple effect of a controlled narrative. Within months, newspapers nationwide ran headlines quoting Ellie's closing lines. "We are not asking for charity. We are demanding our rights as Americans." That phrase became a rallying cry in Detroit, Philadelphia, and even San Francisco. Local leaders adapted it. "We are not asking for water fountains. We are demanding our rights as Californians." Ellie's ability to craft a message that was both deeply personal and universally resonant ensured her words rippled outward, reshaping the national conversation. It's a testament to the lasting power of storytelling when wielded with care. By mastering her narrative, blending vulnerable honesty with disciplined strategy, Ellie transformed from a frightened child into a beacon of courage for a nation. She showed that controlling your story isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about channeling that emotion into a clear, consistent message that inspires action. When Ellie walked back into her childhood neighborhood after that victory speech at the Civic Auditorium, she felt a curious mix of pride and responsibility. The same streets where she once trudged home with heavy arms laden with laundry now buzzed with possibility. Neighbors who remembered her as the shy girl clutching Miss Ellie's books now greeted her with cheers and hopeful smiles. It was here, among these familiar faces and cracked sidewalks, that she sensed the next chapter of her life, beckoning a role that would require more than marches and speeches, but the steady work of crafting policy and building institutions. 1. Transitioning from activist to elected official. Months before Ellie announced her candidacy for a seat on the Birmingham City Council, community leaders gathered in the Fellowship Hall of 16th Street Baptist Church. They reminded her that winning a seat meant shifting from protester to policymaker, a transition many activists struggle with. "In the streets, you rally hearts," her friend and NOACP lawyer Clara Thompson told her, "but in office, you rewrite budgets, negotiate with bureaucrats, and push ordinances across the finish line." Ellie embraced the challenge. She spent evenings poring over municipal codes with City Council member Henry Gaines, learning how zoning laws could perpetuate segregation by relegating black families to under-resourced neighborhoods. She studied city budgets with the finance director, tracing how funds for parks and libraries favored white districts near Mountain Brook, while playgrounds in her old neighborhood lay rusting, surrounded by broken glass. When she announced her campaign for a Birmingham that works for all of us, she did so not with lofty rhetoric, but with a detailed platform: infrastructure, equity, repair, crumbling sidewalks and streetlights in historically marginalized neighborhoods within the first year. Education access. Allocate funding to renovate schools in black districts and expand after-school programs by 50%. Health clinics. Establish 3 federally funded community health centers offering sliding-scale services. Small business support. Create microgrants and low-interest loans for minority-owned enterprises. Her messaging echoed lessons from her activist days. Speak plainly, connect policy to people's lives, and offer concrete actions. That clarity contrasted sharply with opponents who waved vague promises but refused to name line items. Campaign trail moments, door-to-door canvassing. Ellie personally knocked on over 2,000 doors, often accompanied by young volunteers whose lives she had once helped change. At Mrs. Freeman's porch, the elderly woman pressed Ellie's hand. "Child, you're the first politician I can call by my first name." Church forums. She spoke at 10 Sunday services, linking her platform's health initiatives to her work on civil rights-era voter registration clinics, illustrating how both battles were about ensuring every citizen had a chance to thrive. Local media town halls. When a white conservative reporter asked, "Why should taxpayers fund facilities in poorer areas?" Ellie responded, "Because every Birmingham resident benefits when all our children learn to read and play safely. A city rises together." On election night, as results trickled in, Ellie stood before her family and supporters in that same church hall. When the moderator raised her hand a first for any black woman in Birmingham, tears streamed down her face. Children in the front row erupted in applause, unaware that their heroine had just shattered another barrier. 2. Policy wins and measuring impact. Ellie's first year on council was a whirlwind of committee meetings, budget hearings, and negotiating alliances with colleagues across the aisle. She learned early that drafting an ordinance was only half the battle. Securing the votes and allocating funds required patience and coalition building. Health equity initiatives. Building on her earlier advocacy, Ellie championed the creation of 3 community health centres. She partnered with a regional hospital, securing federal grants under the newly established Office of Minority Health. The clinics named in honour of her mother, Elelyn Johnson Health Centre, offered paediatric screenings, maternal services, and free vaccinations. Measurable outcomes. Within 18 months, infant mortality in those neighbourhoods dropped by 30%, and vaccination rates rose from 60% to 90%. Patients reported shorter wait times and fewer trips across town for basic care. Education and youth programs. Ellie's push to renovate West End Elementary meant freshly painted classrooms, upgraded heating systems, and a new library. She also allocated funds for after-school STEM and arts programs, hiring local college students as mentors. Impact metrics. Student attendance improved by 15%, homework completion rates climbed by 25%, and standardized test scores saw a 10-point uptick within 2 years. Teachers reported higher morale, and families expressed renewed pride in their school. Small business micro-grants. Drawing on her husband Samuel's experience growing a workshop into a factory, Ellie established a micro-grant program. Over 3 funding rounds, 45 minority-owned businesses received $3,000 to $500,000 each to expand inventory hire employees or open storefronts. Economic indicators. Within a year, participating businesses reported a combined 20% increase in revenue and created 68 new jobs, boosting local employment rates in targeted districts. These concrete results not only improved lives, but also vindicated Ellie's conviction that policy, when informed by lived experience and measured with clear metrics, can be as transformative as protest. 3. Balancing passion with governance. Holding office introduced Ellie to frustrations she hadn't faced on the picket line. Endless procedural debates, ribbon-cutting photo ops that felt hollow, and constituents demanding miracles on impossible timelines tested her resolve. Yet she drew on her activist roots to stay grounded. Community listening sessions every quarter. Ellie hosted coffee with the council member in local diners. She listened to concerns from potholes on 8th Avenue to calls for more streetlights, maintaining her belief that governing starts with hearing. Transparent reporting. She published quarterly Ellie's dashboard in both print and online, tracking progress on each initiative with clear charts and personal stories from neighbours. This level of transparency built trust and made civic engagement feel accessible. Mentoring next-gen leaders. Remembering her own mentors, Ellie launched a summer fellowship for college students interested in public policy, offering internships in her office and pairing them with city department heads. Through these practices, Ellie balanced the fiery urgency of activism with the deliberate pace of governance, ensuring her work remained both dynamic and accountable. 4. The importance of measurable change. Activists often speak of the 100-year arc bending toward justice, but Ellie understood that each legislative session offered tangible steps along that curve. By demanding data pre- and post-policy metrics, she demonstrated that social progress isn't merely aspirational, it's quantifiable. Annual impact reports. Ellie's office published an annual report summarizing key indicators' health outcomes, school performance, economic growth, contextualized with community voices. This approach inspired neighboring cities to adopt similar reporting frameworks. Peer learning networks. She convened city council members from across Alabama to share best practices, fostering a regional coalition focused on equity. These peer networks accelerated policy adoption elsewhere, illustrating how one city's success can seed broader reform. 5. Lessons for today. Protest and policy as twin engines of change. Ellie's journey from the Birmingham jail to City Hall embodies a powerful synthesis. The moral clarity and energy of protest must be matched by the detailed work of policy design and implementation. Here are key lessons for modern changemakers. Translate grassroots energy into governance. Movements mobilize the public. Elected office allocates resources. Encourage citizen activists to run for local boards, school committees, or councils to institutionalize change. Define success with data. Use clear metrics, health statistics, educational outcomes, economic indicators to track progress. Publicize results transparently to sustain support and course correct when needed. Build cross-sector coalitions. Partner with non-profits, businesses, faith groups, and legal advocates. Diverse coalitions bring resources, expertise, and credibility, amplifying impact. Maintain community connection. Never lose touch with the people you serve. Regular listening sessions, mentorship programs, and open dashboards keep governance grounded in lived realities. Invest in the next generation. Create fellowships, internships, and mentorship pipelines to cultivate future leaders who blend activism's fervor with policymaking's pragmatism. Ellie's story reminds us that freedom is not a destination, but an ongoing commitment, one that thrives when citizens combine moral courage with systematic strategy. From the dusty streets of her childhood to the polished floors of City Hall, she wove protest and policy into a tapestry of lasting progress. And as her granddaughter Marion now studies public health in college, she carries forward that legacy proof that when movements meet measurements, when hearts meet spreadsheets, the arc of justice not only bends, but soars.